U.S. President Donald Trump moving swiftly on his first day, signing a raft of executive orders within hours of taking office. His action includes steps to curb immigration, roll back environmental regulations, and pull out from an international climate treaty. Cheered on by a crowd of supporters at Capital One Arena, the newly sworn-in leader repealed 78 executive actions of the previous administration, including one on addressing the risks of artificial intelligence. For more analysis on those executive orders, let's speak to Markus Wagner. He's a professor of law at the University of Wollongong, Australia. Professor, thank you for making the time to speak with us. Looking at Mr. Trump's executive orders, he signed a flurry of different ones, but breaking from tradition, he signed many of them in front of crowds at the Capital One Arena before heading to the Oval Office. Why is that? Any significance or strategy to that?
So we saw the celebrations being moved indoors because of the weather, and that gave President Trump a really good platform for showing resolve and determination to do away with many of the policies of the Biden administration. And we see that resolve displayed, if you will, in the way that these were signed in that particular arena, but also in terms of substance. And we should make no mistake, the U.S. has moved significantly, and Trump has moved the U.S. significantly in his own ways now. And we see that, as you already indicated, through the policies themselves.
Let's turn to his moves on cracking down on immigration. He signed a slate of executive actions. Were we expecting all of this? How will declaring a national emergency at the southern border tackle the immigration issues the country is facing?
So the immigration narrative is central to Donald Trump's victory in this in the November election. The interesting thing is that the so-called border crisis has ameliorated quite a bit and decreased, if you look at the number of illegal immigrants, if you want to call them that, into the United States over the last months and year. And so what the president is essentially doing is fulfilling a promise that he made during the elections, but that really sort of lacks in reality to a certain degree, but it plays to his base very much. And what he's using is a post-Watergate law that is there for extraordinary circumstances, which I just don't see happening at the moment at the border, but which then allows the military to come in. And that again shows resolve and sort of a very muscular attitude, not just like 8 years ago to help the law enforcement, but take an active part in what he said to secure the border and bring back the sovereignty of the U.S.
Could his moves to secure the border do more harm than good? Are Americans in support of his moves?
His supporters are certainly in support of these moves, and as is true for most policies in the U.S., the population is by and large split almost evenly, but that momentum has certainly carried him to victory in November, and that's what that's certainly the basis for his policies today.
Turning to his withdrawal from the Paris climate deal, that was widely expected. But why was it such a priority for him?
So if you cast your mind back to 2017, Donald Trump already withdrew the U.S. From the Paris Accord. And the question why this is so important is probably a number of rationales, not least of which is sort of the idea that there's a sort of sense of that climate change is not man-made, and that so there's a denial of that very fact. I think we have plenty of evidence for this by now. Then you have moneyed interests in the oil and gas industry that would see any kind of limitations on emissions as an anti-business move. It's interesting to look here, I think, at the polls, because a minority of U.S. adults actually favor this kind of withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. But again, it was one of the planks of his platform to get reelected.
His executive orders clearly intending to undo many of Mr. Biden's policies. What are the potential ramifications of this?
So You have to look at this both domestically and internationally. And domestically, this is signaling a break from something that he clearly, in his various speeches today, saw as the U.S. sliding into chaos, sort of a bit reminiscent of the American carnage mentality that he already portrayed in 8 years ago, in 2017. Internationally, I think it continues to isolate the U.S. considerably at a time when, for all intents and purposes, we would need more cooperation with respect to climate change, with respect to potential pandemics or epidemics coming up, with respect to wars in Gaza, with respect to the war in Ukraine. All of that signals a weakening in the retrenchment of the U.S. that other countries will now have to react to.
You mentioned the war in Gaza. His decision to revoke sanctions imposed against Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank is raising concerns in the Middle East. Could this have any impact on the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas?
This is really hard to say, but his comments about Gaza as such, which were a bit of a throwaway line if you listen to them, seemed to me almost from a sort of a real estate mogul perspective, sort of like a barren landscape now that just needs to be rebuilt differently. It's really hard to say whether Hamas, how Hamas will react to it. It certainly emboldens the far right-wing elements of the Israeli government at the moment that have put a stranglehold on the Netanyahu government that has been in a coalition with them for quite some time. So the prospects for lasting peace, I think, have actually diminished with that policy move.
And President Trump also signed pardons for 1,500 January 6th Capitol rioters. What message does this send to the public?
So again, if we think back about 4 years ago to January 6th, the language that Trump uses with respect to these people, they were J6 hostages. And so the Biden administration, or the criminal justice system, if you will, held these people hostage in his mind. And so the message, to my mind, is very clear, namely that this is sort of a recasting of the entire narrative, that what happened on January 6th was not some kind of attempted coup, was not some kind of violent attempt at overturning the elections, but was rather just a continuation of politics. And that's the kind of messaging that I think Trump has tried to convey over the last 4 years. And it's rather shocking if you look at court decisions that have been made. Some individuals have been sentenced have been sentenced for up to 22 years, and they're very likely or have already been pardoned. The message that that's sending is that apparently violent behavior, and some of these individuals were violent in the context, is acceptable in trying to overturn elections. And I think that sets a very dangerous pathway, not only within the U.S., but also with respect to other countries.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing your insights with us. We were speaking to Markus Wagner, Professor of Law from the University of Wollongong, Australia.